Okay, the title of this message is First Love and Boldness. So the title is First Love and Boldness, First Love. There was a wonderful church mentioned directly by Jesus Christ. We'll talk about a little bit of this in the Bible study in the next week or two as well. Christ praised this church a lot. He praised this church a lot for rejecting false apostles. He praised them for rejecting false doctrines. He commended them for their faithfulness and their strength. And really said a lot of wonderful things about the church at Ephesus, which was the main city in the province of Asia, there in Asia Minor, where Paul built and his followers built a lot of great churches. Actually, Paul didn't build all the churches. He mentions at least two that had never seen him by face. And you probably remember those scriptures, like Laodiceans. They had never actually seen Paul, but his followers, well, actually, just to tell the story, you might know it, but if not, he actually rented a school in Ephesus for services and stayed there 3 years. Paul rarely stayed that long anywhere. And he built up a big church, which is very big in church history, an Ephesians church, and his followers went out through the province, and they built a lot of churches. And a lot of these churches are on a mail route, and Christ uses that mail route to deliver messages. So here's the first letter, and actually the book of Revelation was a letter delivered to these 7 churches. I want to look at Revelation 2, to the wonderful church at Ephesus, one of Paul's greatest churches, but they had one fatal flaw. It's a great church, one fatal flaw. We're going to go to Revelation 2. We're going to pick it up in verse 4. And if you have a Bible where the words of Christ are in red, it's in red, because Christ, through the vision, dictated all this to the Apostle John. Revelation 2:4. Well, we'll pick it up. Before I read the verse, we're going to pick it up in verse 3. Let me say one thing about first love, because that's his criticism of them, is about first love. The one fatal flaw they had was loss of first love. I think it's a natural thing to drift from your first love and to taking things for granted. I mean, anything that you can think of, I won't mention a bunch of things, but anything that you can think of that you're enthused about, you love, it's natural over time to lose that first exciting enthusiasm. So it's a natural thing. I think it's just human. So, and I think we're going to talk a little bit this morning about how to be bold toward God in prayer, which I think helps a little bit. And it's normal for people to lose enthusiasm. Anything you are enthusiastic about, it'll flag over time. So we're going to look at a few things we can do to try to win the battle, to be a winner when it comes to not losing our first love. Or if we've lost it, and everybody has to some extent, if you're honest, how we can get it back, how we can move in the direction we want to get back that first love. How to reinstitute our first love, because it's a very tough obstacle. Okay, Revelation 2, verse 3 and 4. And he says a lot of wonderful things about this church. And you have borne and have patience, and for my name's sake have labored, and you've not fainted. In other words, you kept up the struggle over, assuming that the dates are right, 95 AD when this is written. There's probably 30-some years this church has been faithful. Verse 4, nevertheless, I have someone against you, because you have left your first love. They lost their first love. When you read it, you kind of think, boy, God is being tough on them. By the way, helping their case, after he says that, he does say something good about them. Verse 5, he says, remember therefore from whence you are fallen, and repent and do the first work, else I will come and remove your candlestick. In other words, you won't be a church of God. You're going to lose that spiritual light. And a lot of churches of God, we believe, have lost their life over the centuries and faded into the world. But then he says something good about them in verse 6. But this you have, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. So even though he's criticized them, he's still complimenting them. So I think it's good when we reject compromising doctrines. And they believe in Nicholas, who started the Nicolaitan movement. His mentor was a Gnostic, and they kind of deny that Christ was really what he said he was, and they get all into Greek philosophy. It's kind of a compromise with the Greek world, and they resisted that. So I think being loyal to God and sticking with his true doctrines does mitigate any mistakes we do make, because you get that impression. He was still impressed with this church, but they had to get that one thing straight, getting back their first love. And we have to also regain or hold on to, whichever position you have, maybe a little of both. We have to regain or hold on to our first love. One of the things I think that will help us is boldness in prayer. Because in boldness in prayer, you try to build a strong relationship with God. And that is a factor in helping us when we need it to regain our first love. Anytime we see it slipping, if we have a good relationship with God, we can be more bold and active for God. And I want to look at the man in the Bible who had the strongest relationship with God in prayer of anybody in the Bible. It's Moses. Actually, Moses says a lot of things about God, that God was slow to anger and great in mercy, and a lot of good things. And I think I'm not going to read the scriptures, but you know the story. It's in 3 places in the Old Testament. It's in Exodus 32 and some other places, in Numbers and Deuteronomy, where Israel, almost within a few weeks of agreeing to the 10 Commandments, they broke the 10 Commandments and started worshiping the golden calf or a young bull, because that's part of paganism. And you said, and even Moses was shocked and mad. Obviously, God was shocked and mad how quickly they fell. People often wonder, they say, well, why does God care about us trying to picture him in a statue or a painting? I don't obviously have all the answers, but it's clear when you read the commandments, God says not to do it. You're going to say, why? And we'll also be able to discuss this a little bit in the Bible study, a little bit too. But I think that when you think about God, God's appearance is pure energy. It says he lives in unapproachable light. I don't think that a good artist, you try to draw a picture of what you think God looks like, or you try to sculpt a statue, what you think God looks like. Now we know from the Bible, and even when Moses was on the mountain with God, we'll talk about that in a minute, we know God has a front and a back, because he says, you can't see my front side, you would die. And even the backside, God had to shelter him behind a rock in his hand, and it was only a quick glance. And even after that, Moses glowed for weeks. I don't know if God's glory and greatness can be pictured in statue, but we know God has a front and a back. He has hands, because it said it. And we're built in the image of God, so he must have a face somewhat similar to ours. I assume 2 legs, 2 arms. But somehow, I don't think we're able to artistically picture God on a drawing or a statue. And that's what people like to do. And then they like to put their worship into the statue. And of course, most paganism is animal worship, a powerful animal like a bear or a bull or a young bull. And then, of course, they get a lot of pagan stuff. The Israelites got, according to some translations, naked and dancing, and who knows what all bad stuff they got into in worshiping the golden idol. And Moses intervened with his prayer, and he saved Israel. God said, I'm going to destroy them, and I'll make a great nation of you. And I don't think that was idle talk. God was mad. By the way, it's interesting, when Moses intervenes for Israel, he doesn't say what you'd expect him to say. Well, they're not all bad. There's some really good people in there. He didn't say that. Because Moses, even when he talked to Aaron after the golden calf, Aaron said, you know how bad these people are? Moses didn't disagree. They were bad. They were stubborn, stiff-necked. We could elaborate further. They liked paganism. They didn't really like the true God. I mean, when you look at the whole thing, Moses taught God out of it by understanding how God thought. He says, look at what the Egyptians and the pagans are going to say. And remember, you made that promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I won't go into everything he said, but Moses understood God, and God had a great relationship with Moses, and Moses changed history. But I want to look at one more incident, but it's related to the same story, how Moses intervened with God. We'll read the verses in a minute, but after what I just described, the golden calf, God said, I'm so mad at these Israelites that I'm not going to stay with you all anymore, because I might get mad anyway, because they're just, they're really, how am I going to put it, rubbing me the wrong way. So I'm going to send the angel in front of you. And Moses said, he said it politely, and you have to read the verses carefully, but basically Moses stood up to God and said, if you don't go, I don't go. I mean, if God didn't go with Israel through the wanderings to the promised land, if you don't go, I don't go. And you can erase me from your book of life. He knew that God wouldn't want to do that, didn't want to do it. But he said that. I mean, in polite language, but when you read it carefully and boil it down, he said, no, we're not going, at least I'm not going. Now, I realize you can say, well, God could have smashed him like roadkill and replaced him. Yes, certainly that is true. And I'm not saying Moses didn't realize God had the power to do anything he wanted. But Moses basically intervened. He put himself at risk for the children of Israel. And God loved Moses so much that we'll read the verses and you'll see what I mean. He changed God's mind. I'm going to pick it up. We're going to go to Exodus 33. This incident has description in other places to give you some of the details, but I think Exodus 33 is a real good place to see most of it. I'll start in 32:32, right before we get to Exodus 33. This is Moses speaking. Yet now, if you will forgive their sin, and if not, blot me out, he means from the book of life, I pray thee, out of your book which thou hast written. Of course, God didn't want to do that. Verse 33, Exodus 33:2. Exodus 33, verse 2 and 3. And God is talking about sending them, into the promised land and their journey. And God says, and I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, all those sites, unto the land flowing with milk and honey. For I will not go up in the middle of you, for you are a stiff-necked people, lest I consume you in the way. So God said no to Moses. Well, Moses politely kept pushing God. Moses' perspective is, I'm guessing this part, but I'm assuming Moses says, yes, I'm sure angels are reliable and powerful and all that, but I don't really trust an angel. I want you, God, to be with us all the way. You're kind of the one I know. I want you to be with us all the way. And if you're not in the midst of us, I don't want to go. And interesting, they actually had a tent far outside the camp where Moses and God would meet face to face. Well, there was a little bit of cloudiness to protect Moses from God's brightness, but roughly face to face, and they'd meet. Because God didn't want to get too close to the Israelites. They were saying a lot of bad stuff, and he resented hearing it being said against Moses and against him. And I think God even realized much of the talk against Moses was really against God. Because it was like, you're doing what God said, so it's easier to attack Moses than it'd be to attack God, but it really was an attack on God. I think God understood all that too, by the way, when Moses was praying for them. Actually, there's even one or two cases where they actually tried to stone Moses. God had to intervene. That's how bad some of the Israelites were. So we should use our prayer and our actions to get closer to God like Moses did. Now, eventually, the tabernacle was built and all the tribes camped around it, and it was in the middle, and the tribe of Levi was in the middle, and the tabernacle was there. And eventually God did meet Moses in the middle of the camp. But Moses had to work on God because God was rightfully upset with the Israelites. And I think we have to try to get that closeness with God that Moses had. You really can't argue with somebody that you don't know well. It's hard to do. But if you know them well and you like them and they like you, you can debate with them, argue with them, maybe change their mind. And that's what God was able to do. That's what Moses was able to do with God. And by the way, nowhere does Moses deny that the Israelites were bad. He's not that dumb, because God wouldn't buy it. 33, verse 5. For the Lord had said unto Moses, say unto the children of Israel, you are stiff-necked people. In other words, you're stubborn. I actually think, not that it's up to me to be a judge or anything, but I think the Israelites and the Jewish people are still very stubborn and argumentative. You all could not agree with that, but it seems to be the case. I will come into the midst of you a moment and consume you. Therefore now put off your ornaments for I may know what to do with you. So God still wasn't sure what to do with them, and he didn't want to be around them. Verse 11, Moses is still working the case. Exodus 33:11. And the Lord spake unto Moses face to face, as a man speaks with a friend. And that's the kind of relationship we want to have with the Father. Now that that veil has been ripped in the temple, we can go directly to God the Father with Jesus Christ at his right hand and try to have that. You have to be respectful. That's God, of course, and all that. But that friendship with God. And he turned again unto the camp. But his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, stayed with the tabernacle or tent. And Moses said unto the Lord, see, verse 12, I say unto you, bring up this people, and you have not let me know who will go, who you'll send with me. In other words, are you coming yourself or an angel? Yet you said, I know you by name. In other words, by name means he really knows Moses, because names have meanings. He knows Moses. He's Moses' friend. And Moses is using that. He says, you say you know me and you like me, and you have also found, and you also have found grace in my sight. In other words, God told Moses that Moses has found grace in his sight. Verse 13, now therefore I pray you, if I have found grace in your sight, show me now your way, that I may know you. I think that was a wonderful thing Moses said. If we can pray to God and say, God, let me know you better. Teach me your ways. Teach me your laws. By the way, if you said that to God, and God might say, well, if that's the case, how come you don't read the Bible much? Or you don't pray every day? Or you don't go places where you can learn more about it, like services and Bible study. So if you say that to God, you need to do things to show that you're serious, because it's not just what you say, it's the actions you take. It's both things. It's both things. So if you tell God, well, I want to know you, God, like Moses, then you should be here and in places where you can get to know God better. That I may know you, that I may find grace in your sight, because even Moses needed it, and we needed even more than Moses, and consider that this nation is your people. Now, sometimes when God was mad at the Israelites, he'd say to Moses, the people that you brought out of Egypt. And Moses would say, no, they're your people that you brought out of Egypt. Maybe it's a little bit of a joke, but Moses was right. They were God's people, and he wanted God to stay with them. And he said, in my presence, verse 14, and he said, this is God saying to Moses, my presence shall go with you, and I will give you rest. In other words, don't worry about it, Moses. I've changed my mind. I will go with you into the promised land. All that wandering, God was with them. And I think it's a wonderful thing that Moses said, I want to know you better. And that seemed to be the point where God changed his mind and said, okay, Moses, I'll go. Because Moses was still holding out. If you don't go, I don't go. Or in a polite way. And I think we should say to God in our prayer, God, I want to know you better. I want to understand you better. And there are a lot of things in the Bible that are not easy to understand, but I think we should be striving to understand them. Like I said, I still wonder why God does not want pictures of him or statues of him. I don't know the full answer, but I really believe God's afraid, or even the grave of Moses, he wouldn't let him know where that was. You'll end up making an idol of that statue, that picture, and you won't really develop a true relationship with the true God. I guess in my words, I'll say God is so great he cannot be encapsulated in a drawing. God is so great he can't be pictured in a human statue. You can maybe argue that, but even if you kind of got close to it, God doesn't want that. And I know the world loves pictures and statues and they fight over them, but God wants you to know him on a spiritual level. Like even when he agreed, by the way, David changed history in more than one case, but when God agreed to have a temple, God told David, you really can't house God in a temple. Because in a sense, the whole world is his footstool. His chair is in heaven. God is as big as GTA, as big as he wants to be, or as small as he wants to be, or needs to be, for whatever he wants to do. Maybe God can't be captured. I was looking at a series that Carl told me about the earth and how huge the powers of the earth are. And realize it's just a small thing that God handles. Trying to understand God and bring him down to our size, like a little photograph or a statue, is probably it's not what God wants. And you could probably only do it to a certain extent. I didn't even realize, I watched the series the other day, the fact that the earth rotates and has apparently some kind of atomic fusion core with iron and nickel. And we see it by the lava coming out of volcanoes that's rotating, and that rotation is more important. It creates a huge magnetic field that shields the earth, I think, out to 400,000 miles and blocks a lot of dangerous radiation. And this, anyway, I can't fully explain it, but you think about the power of that. This whole planet is one big atomic, whatever it is, defense. And that's why Earth is so special. And other planets don't have that protection, and their life couldn't live on them. And that's just one little thing that God did. There's a whole bunch of other stuff. God is too immense and too powerful for us to picture with even a good statue of him. It still doesn't quite get it. I'm guessing that, but that's what I think. Finishing reading verse 13, he says that I may know you, that I may find grace in your sight, and consider that this nation is your people. Verse 14, and he said, my presence shall go with you, and I will give you rest, meaning don't worry about it, Moses. Verse 15, and he said unto him, if thy presence go not with me, carry us not up hence. In other words, we don't want to go if you're not with us, God. But that does show a love of God, doesn't it? It shows a love of God, a trust in God. I don't know if he's saying he doesn't trust the angels, but he'd rather have God there himself. And I think that shows a great love of God. But he said it in a polite way, and God responded to it in a polite, appropriate way. Verse 18 of Exodus 33. And he said, I beseech you, show me your glory. Now the rest of it, he said, if you really love me, Moses said, show me your glory. When he went on the mountain before, God was hidden behind this cloud that blocked all his supernatural glow. And God said, well, you can only see my back and only in a moving glance. And Moses got to see that. And that was so overwhelmingly powerful that Moses came down off the mountain glowing for weeks. He had to put a veil over his face not to scare people. And he just saw a glance of God's backside. That's how glorious God is. You know, in 1 John 3, 1 and 2, we read it all the time. John says that when Christ comes back in the second coming, we will be able to see him because we will be like him. Think about what that means. We'll be able to look God in the face, which even Moses, as great as he was, could not do, because we'll be like him. We'll be in the same family. I've assumed we'll have a little glow where God has a big bright glow, and it may take us thousands of years to learn all the stuff we need to learn, but we'll be in God's family. Think about it, being in God's family. All we have to do is stay with Christ now and regain our first love, and I'm not saying that's easy, because the devil in this world wants you to backslide and slide away from God and get complacent and comfortable. And it happens to people all the time, as we well know. But wow, he got to see God. I believe Moses is the only man who got to really see God in his glorified form in the entire history of the world. And remember, God lives in unapproachable light. So if we say we want to know God better, we say, God, I want to see you, then you ought to read the Bible a lot, read church literature, go to services, go to Bible studies, spend time with God. By the way, you might ask, why is our Sabbath services, why is the Sabbath important? It's important. If you had a friend, but you never had time for that friend, your friendship would have to get colder and colder and colder, right? Because you don't have time for the friend. Well, what God does in the Sabbath, one, we need to rest from work. Maybe we're retired, so it's not as bad now, but when we were younger, we did. We need to rest from work, although I think Carl stays busy all the time. We need to rest from work, but we have to give priority time to God, because that's what the Sabbath law means. We got to give priority time to God every week. Every week we have to give priority time to God. It's built into the law. You can't, and I know people like to do this. There may be exceptional things, but you can't play golf on the Sabbath. You can't swim a marathon on the Sabbath, and we could rattle about exceptions and all that, but you get my idea. We have to spend our time, I call it Christian fellowship, time with God, more godly things. But quality time is what you need to build first love, what you need to build friendship. Now I have one corny joke. Maybe I'll tell somebody asked me to tell this joke I told last night. Maybe I'll tell it, see if I can remember this joke by heart. 3 people end up at the pearly gate. A teacher, a guy that works in septic tanks. He's a septic tank repairman, cleaner, and a lawyer. So St. Peter says, well, each of you has to answer one question to get in. So the teacher, he says, well, there's a movie about a ship that hit an iceberg. Can you name the movie? And this is when it was fairly current. The teacher said, yeah, it's the Titanic. You get in. To the septic tank worker, St. Peter thought, do I want all those horrible smells inside the pearly gate? I'll ask him a difficult question. He said, how many people died in the Titanic? Well, the septic tank worker knew because he had just seen the movie. 1,228. St. Peter was shocked. You get to go in. Then up comes the lawyer. He says to the lawyer, name all 1,228 people. He didn't want the lawyer stench in there. By the way, if you want to break a law or get around something, go to a lawyer, because that's what, they know the law and they know how to, I won't call it legally lie, but yes, I will. You know what I'm saying, don't you? How to work. And by the way, I admit too, if you're in trouble, because the legal system can be daunting, you do need a lawyer. So I'm not denying that too. It can be a daunting system to get involved in. But I'm going to tell another story, just because I can. This is called The Sergeant. Well, snarled the tough old sergeant to the bewildered private, I suppose after you get out of the Army, you'll just be waiting for me to die so you can spit in my grave, right? Because I can tell you hate me, right? And the private said, not me, Sarge. Once I get out of the Army, I never ever want to stand in long lines again. Actually, and that story is kind of corny, but it could be the tough sergeant actually had their best. You know what I mean? He may be trying to save them by making them tougher. And anyway, but I think sometimes when God disciplines us, we have to love him anyway. Maybe not like the mean sergeant, but you get the general idea. God is not our waiter who just wants to make life easy for us. God, get me another porterhouse steak. I think that's a wrong image of God. Sometimes he does discipline us. Sometimes you learn more by struggling, but we have to learn to love God, because whatever he does, he's doing it for our good. You just kind of have to know that. By the way, if you compare David's life to Saul, David had a much tougher time to the crown, but David was the greatest king in the Bible, maybe in part because he had to struggle. I think it's been like 14 or 15 years as an outlaw to varying degrees running from Saul. And David wanted to be close to God. He really did, and set a great example. Okay, let's get to the how to recapture our first love. The number one thing I want to say is, if we want to recapture first love, build a strong relationship with God through prayer and actions. Remember I said and action, so you got to do the things that are appropriate as well. And I would also add, even when there's no crisis, because let's look at it this way. It's easy when you're in trouble and they're coming to get you to run to God in prayer, save me. I mean, we all understand that, right? Or when you're hurting. But think about it, isn't it even more noble to pray to God when you're not in trouble? When things are normal? Because the last thing you want God to feel is, well, the only way I can bring this person to their knees and praying to me or doing the right thing is to keep them in a constant crisis. You don't want to send that message to God, right? You can, like some of us will get to go to the place of safety. We don't need a crisis. We've proven to God we're already with him. So try to build that strong relationship with God through prayer and action, just like Moses did. Diplomatically, of course. And you'll be able to ask God for more things with more faith, because you know you're building a relationship with God and you're doing the right thing. And that, if you're doing the right thing, you'll have more confidence in prayer that God is going to listen to you. Like Moses knew that God loved him and was with him, and that helps. The second thing in regarding regaining first love is give God the highest priority in your life. We live in an age of spoiled people or disillusioned people. They don't, and I say this in general, society in general, not everybody, but more people than you might think. You know, we're kind of all disillusioned and spoiled, and we don't really believe in anything. We're not that, we kind of believe in God, but not enough to go to church regularly. We kind of believe in the Bible, as long as it doesn't get in our way and stop us from doing what we really want to do. We kind of believe in morality, but it can't slow us down too much. We're patriotic, but we don't want to get too carried with patriotism. We're loyal to our family, but not too much so. You know, I don't want to take care of Granny. I'll just let the state take care of her in some state nursing home. I was talking to a grandmother. Actually, she was examining my eyes. It's a long story, but she wanted to talk, so I let her talk. And so anyway, she was talking about how she takes off work and then they make her work later hours so she can pick up the grandkids for her daughter, really helping her daughter a lot. And she said, I do that because my mother did it for me. She went on to the story of how her mother had a bad divorce, but really sacrificed to take care of her. And then she took care of her mother in her later years, and she says, and she's 71 now, and a grandmother, and she's doing all kinds of things to help her daughter, who also had a bad divorce, to help her with her grandkids. And she says, and the trade-off is, when I get older, I tell the grandkids, they're going to be there for me, right? By the way, that's what it used to be before Social Security. The younger generation took care of the older generation. And in some ways, I think that was spiritually better for everybody. I'm not putting Social Security down, but anyway, you get the general point. A lot of people, send granny or great granny to the state and give me your money and let the state take care of you. Some state nursing home where you know those state workers really love you. You see those ads on TV. Oh well, I actually heard some bad stories about nursing homes, but I'm sure they're good ones. But state worker is not going to love a person like their own relatives would. Take my word, it's just not going to happen. But we live in an age where people are spoiled. They don't want to sacrifice for anybody else. And in a way, the Bible predicted that. I'm going to go to Revelation 3, and we could talk about this more in the Bible study, about the principle. But in the last age, and the church is influenced by the world around it, I want you to notice this attitude that existed, and I think is starting to show up more and more in the society we live in. Revelation 3, verse 14, we call it the Laodicean attitude. And unto the angel of the church of Laodicea write these things, says the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation of God. I know your works, that you are neither cold nor hot. I wish you were cold or hot. So then, because you're lukewarm, neither cold, I will spew you out of my mouth, or spit you out of my mouth. In other words, if you were hot like hot tea, I'd enjoy having you. Or if you were cold, I could, work with you in a later time period, because you know nothing of the truth. But they were neither. They had a little bit of truth, but they were totally lukewarm. They had drifted. I believe we're in an age where a lot of people are lukewarm about everything, or more so than they ought to be. You'll hear the politicians say, we got to fire up our base. And I guess that's a big part of winning now, firing up your base, get them mad about something or scared about something, because people are complacent. I think that's the age we live in. Verse 17, and the Laodiceans said, Revelation 3:17, because you say, I am rich, increased with goods, and have need of nothing. I want to emphasize the word, have need of nothing. You don't need anything. By the way, the city of Laodicea was prosperous compared to some of the other cities on that mail route. Now, what does prosperity do to people? You don't appreciate God when you don't need Him. They were comparing Protestant churches in Europe and those in Africa. And the African Protestant churches are growing because they're in some tough places, tough situations, both of their Islamic neighbors, and there's a lot of poverty and problems. Well, Western Europe is relatively prosperous. I'm not saying there aren't some problems, but they're relatively prosperous. And in that prosperity, church attendance is practically nothing in Europe. Nobody cares. And would you say the world we live in is prosperous? And I know we all have bills and credit card debt, and I'm not trying to say we've got it made, but relatively speaking to what most people in the world suffer, and in the history of the world, we're spoiled. We're safe. We have religious freedom. They're not persecuting us like they were talking about Syria the other day. And one of the good things about Assad and Gaddafi and a few other dictators, they didn't let the Muslim radicals persecute the Christians much. They could, the Christians were secondary religion, some problems, but they still didn't let them murder them and kill them. But once the Islamic radicals got there, horrible things happened to them, and it's still happening to them. And in other words, much of the world does not have religious freedom. We just think it's a norm, but it's not a norm in the world. And some places more subtle, they have an official religion of the government. I'm told even if you go to the country just south of us and you leave the Catholic Church and you're of that nationality, you face some problems. And most Americans don't know that. I heard that from a guy. I said, wow, we're safe. We're spoiled. Our bellies are full, and we have toys like guns and cars and boats and high definition TVs, and we may not think we're spoiled, but we really are spoiled. And when you're spoiled, you don't see a need for God. I don't need God. I don't need anything. Isn't that the natural tendency? And in the countries where people are starving and scared, they're coming to God in large numbers. And that is, and it's good in that context. Hopefully we won't have to suffer to get back to God. We should do it on our own. Let's go to 1 Thessalonians 5. We're going to read 1 Thessalonians 5:19. Our goal is to get back to God without God having to bludgeon us over the head. 1 Thessalonians 5:19 reads, "Quench not the Spirit." How could you quench God's Spirit? If God's Spirit is in you, and you keep doing bad things, never repenting, bad things, no repenting, bad things, no repenting, and you start ignoring God, ignoring the pull of His Spirit, it's sort of like fire. You quench it with water and it just dies and it withdraws from you. Remember how bad Saul was once God took the Holy Spirit away from him. You don't want to do that. And notice verse 20 in the same context. Despise not prophesying. And what he means is, that means inspire preaching. It's not just about prophecy, although a church that doesn't teach prophecy, and there are some of them that don't teach it anymore, that's a weaker church. They only teach, say, the same topics the world teaches only. And what I'm saying is, try to appreciate all the sermons, because it's the way you listen to it, how much you get out of it. Like, I used to tell this to students, and I thought of it myself when I was in school, and sometimes I did it and sometimes I didn't. I said, you want to come out of this class knowing as much as you can. And there's even less to study for the final, because you got it, you know it. It's how you listen. Really try to get something out of it. When you read articles and watch DVDs and other things, listen so you can get something out of it. That's what Paul is saying to them. Appreciate sermons and articles, and it's how we listen. The number 3 thing, and the last thing I want to say, and this one may be even hard to define, but first love is regaining enthusiasm for God. Regaining enthusiasm for God's ways and God's things. Regaining enthusiasm for His meeting, His word. So let's go back a few pages of 2 Timothy 4, where Paul gives ministerial advice to Timothy. 2 Timothy 4, we're going to pick it up in verse 7. And here's what Paul says, and see if you can sense the enthusiasm in Paul. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Think about that, a good fight. He kept the faith. Henceforth is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them also that love His appearing. So be enthusiastic and fight to stay close to God. And that's what we had at first. And we'll love God's appearance. One final scripture, 2 Corinthians 8. In 2 Corinthians 8, Paul shows some of his enthusiasm for God. 2 Corinthians 8, I'm going to read a whole section, verse 1 through 5. Paul says, Moreover, brethren, we do you wit of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, how that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded unto you the riches of their liberality. What he's trying to do is guilt the rich Corinthian church to give like the poor Macedonian church, because the poor Macedonian church had a lot of enthusiasm for God's work. And even though they were poor, Paul is saying they gave enthusiastically. And I'm going to go to verse 5. He's saying why he thinks the Macedonian church, and I think he's guilting the Corinthians, a wealthier church, to follow the poor church's example. And this they did, not as we hoped, but first they gave their own selves to the Lord and unto us by the will of God. So what he's saying is the Macedonian church was so generous because they gave themselves to God. If we give ourselves to God, We can have mature first love. It's better in a way. I think mature first love is better than the regular first love. We can gain our first love, but mature first love.